proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I note that all of our members are joining the hearing remotely and that witnesses are in the main committee room in Parliament House. I will, on that basis, encourage everyone participating by video conference or on the phone to briefly identify themselves to assist people listening online. And I will now call on witnesses from the Department of Finance. For the Hansard record, can you please state your full names and the capacity in which you're appearing before the committee?
Nathan Williamson, Deputy Secretary, Finance.
Scott Delly, First Assistant Secretary, Finance.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege, and will now proceed. Do you have an opening statement you wanted to give?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I do have an opening statement. I believe that's also been circulated to the committee, but I'll read that if that's okay.
Thank you.
And so the opening statement, I think, follows our last hearing and I guess it attempts to cover a range of issues that were raised with us in the last hearing to help the committee understand the process that we went through in bringing the bill together. So under the Administrative Arrangements Order, the Department of Finance is responsible for electoral matters, which includes the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918 and the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act 1984. Finance undertakes this responsibility by providing policy advice to government. This includes advice on the framework for conducting referendums. The government has committed to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, including holding a referendum to constitutionally enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament. Since May 2022, Finance has been providing advice to the government on electoral and referendum matters. Finance first provided briefing that referred to referendum matters to the Special Minister of State in his capacity as Minister responsible for electoral matters on 2 June 2022. Subsequently, the Minister asked Finance to progress options on amendments to the Referendum Act. This work was framed in terms of updating the Referendum Act to align, where appropriate, with the Electoral Act and to ensure that the legislative framework could support a referendum conducted during the 47th Parliament. Since the first briefing, there have been a number of written briefings provided to the Minister on referendum-related issues. The dates for those briefings are 4 July, these are all 2022, 4 July, 22 August, 27 and 28 September, 30 September, 14 and 26 October, 14, 21 and 23 November. In addition, there have been a series of meetings and discussions on referendum-related issues with the Minister and all his staff. The Referendum Machinery Provisions Amendment Bill 2022 represents the decisions of government. Matters covered by the bill have been considered by the Cabinet and its subcommittees, the Constitutional Recognition Committee and the Expenditure Review Committee. To this point, I note that it has been long-standing recognised practice not to disclose information about the operation and business of the Cabinet and the Cabinet subcommittees, as to do so could potentially reveal the deliberations of Cabinet which are confidential. Modernising the Referendum Act is important given it has not been used since 1999. The amendments in the bill support the conduct of a referendum in a contemporary setting that is consistent with people's experience of federal elections, including integrity and transparency measures. In drafting the bill, consideration was given to past parliamentary committee inquiries and reports, including those of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters and the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social, Policy and Legal Affairs. If it's okay, we've got then a couple of examples, but I'll skip those from the statement and recognise they're in the written statement that's been tabled. Moving down, developing the bill has been a collaborative and iterative process. From the outset, Finance has had regular discussions with stakeholders, often multiple contacts on a daily basis. Finance has been undertaking its work in regular and close consultation with relevant entities, including the Australian Electoral Commission, The AEC has operational responsibility for delivering a referendum. The National Indigenous Australians Agency, the NIAA, has policy responsibility for the voice to Parliament, and also through the NIAA, First Nation leaders have been consulted as part of the Referendum Engagement Group and Referendum Working Group. The Attorney General's Department is responsible for constitutional law, and the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, who under the Administrative Arrangements Orders have portfolio responsibility for Commonwealth, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy programs and service delivery and promotion of reconciliation. As part of their work, the AEC and NIAA have commissioned research. Questions relating to the scope and conduct of that research should be directed to the AEC and NIAA. As previously noted, regular consultation has also been undertaken through briefings and discussions with the Minister and or his staff during the development of the bill. Thank you. You might be on mute, Chair.
Thank you very much. It's clearly the start of a new year and I've forgotten how to unmute myself. No questions from me. Who from the opposition would like to begin questions? Senator Payne.
Thanks, Chair, and can I thank the officials for joining us today. Mr. Williamson, is that opening statement from your perspective intended to be the response to the questions that you took on notice in the previous hearing?
Senator, we are still working through those questions that we took on notice and intend to respond to those. But given the time period and the holiday period and also some sickness among staff, we haven't been able to provide the written responses to those. So we will also come back to those.
Thank you. That's helpful guidance. Do you have any idea around the timing on which you might do that?
We would hope to settle it in the next week. But we'll also look at any questions we take on notice from today.
Okay. I understand your point in relation to the department's questions asked directly of the department, but you also did make some reference to claims of public interest immunity in the last hearing. And the opening statement does not address that or cover that area, except in the fact that you note in a general sense that Cabinet consideration is grounds for a claim. Claims, of course, can only be issued by ministers. Have those been progressed, notwithstanding the issues that you've referred to in the department? And is there a reason why you wouldn't have those with you today?
So there's two parts to that. I mean, at the last hearing, I did not claim public interest immunity or seek to. Senator McGrath raised the issue, and I took that on notice to speak to the minister about that, and that is being progressed.
Do you have a time frame for the committee in relation to that?
We will seek to do that in the same time period.
Okay. So in terms of being able to go to questions that were asked but not answered in the previous hearing, you are still in the process of putting those responses together, if I understand you correctly.
That's correct, Senator.
Okay. Can I check then a couple of other things, including more discussion in relation to the issuing of public material for this proposed referendum. You will have seen that there is ongoing public discussion. Has the Department of Finance been involved in any further discussions about the issuing of material for yes and no cases since we last met?
No, Senator.
Has the Department of Finance provided any further advice to government? I don't expect you to go to the nature of that advice at this point, but any further advice to government in relation to these issues?
No, Senator.
Has the Department of Finance had any discussions with the Australian Electoral Commission in relation to these issues? I note that in their previous evidence, when they appeared after you in December, they stated that 40% of Australians use the household guide that is mailed to them each election as the primary source of information about the electoral process. Has the Australian Electoral Commission raised that with you, or have you raised it with them?
No, Senator.
Did your department consider that when you provided advice to government on the removal of the pamphlet to households?
So in providing advice to government on the referendum bill, we provided a range of options, and our advice was always done in consultation with the Australian Electoral Commission.
Including on that point, Mr. Williamson, in relation to the use by over a third of Australians of the household guide that's mailed to them each election?
I don't recall that specific point, but in our discussions with the Australian Electoral Commission over now a number of months, they've had the opportunity to put forward their advice, which I'm assuming would have included any research information that they have access to.
So it sounds to me like there may be, I don't know, and I'm happy to be corrected, Mr. Williamson, some disconnect between the perspective that the Australian Electoral Commission, and certainly the statistic that the Australian Electoral Commission advanced, and what's been taken into consideration or used as a basis for decision making between the government and the department, if this is not a factor that's been considered?
I don't believe there's been any disconnect. We've worked in close consultation with the Australian Electoral Commission throughout the development of this bill. The Australian Electoral Commission has also, as an independent officer, an independent organisation, had the opportunity to provide advice to government.
Yes, I understand that, and appreciate that that was the evidence that that you gave in your previous remarks. Chair, I'll leave it there, and I think perhaps Senator Cadell has some questions.
Thank you, Senator Payne. Senator Cadell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to the financial disclosure, and we went through this closely, but just didn't examine stuff. How does the current legislation propose to track the flow of money, any donor to any entity?
I'm sorry, we're having a lot of trouble hearing you. If we could try the question again.
I will move a microphone closer. How does the current legislation propose to track the flow of money from any donor to any entity? Noah?
So under the, sorry, yes, we could hear you. Under the bill before Parliament, brings in a financial disclosure regime, which is modelled on the regime that's used in the Electoral Act. And so referendum entities will need to disclose donations above the threshold. In 22-23, that threshold is $15,200. And that's indexed by CPI moving forward, similar to the Electoral Act. And so referendum entities will be required to disclose donations, cumulative donations above that level. They will be required to disclose the total amounts, the total number of donors, and they'll also be required to disclose any individual donor who donates above that threshold in a single donation or multiple donations during the period. And that role will be undertaken, the financial disclosure regime will be undertaken by the Australian Electoral Commission. Sorry, I think you're on mute. Oh. Sorry, we can't hear you.
I think we've lost Senator Cadell there. I presume he's maybe going to try and log back in. Did other members have questions?
Kate, it's James Stevens here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Do you mind if I ask a couple just while we wait for Senator Dell?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Just turning to the foreign interference side of things, can I just ask, how does this current scheme, or thinking about how it operates with federal elections, how does the current scheme require entities to avoid foreign donations?
So foreign donations above $100 are not permissible under the legislation.
And that's overseen by the AEC, is it?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just clarifying. That's just the same as a federal general election or a by-election.
Yes, that's
same
correct.
Regimes in place, right? And
the 100. Sorry,
what about?
Sorry to cut you off. I was going to say that the $100 threshold. The reason why it's $100 is because if you had, for example, a tourist in the country, someone like that who drops $5 in something, you don't want to be picking that up. So that's why it's not $0.
Yep. And what about foreign entities that have already made donations to bodies that will be campaigning in the referendum?
So under the bill, the period is for 6 months prior to the issuing of the writ for the referendum. So any donations that are picked up in that period would need to be disclosed.
And sorry, just to dig into that, I mean, if an organisation receives foreign financial support, not necessarily specific to the referendum campaign, but that entity then decides to participate in the referendum and it expends money that may or may not have included money that's come from a foreign source that wasn't given to them for the campaign, but has been nonetheless held as retained earnings for them. What, if anything, and maybe it doesn't, prevent money that's come from foreign sources being used in this campaign if it's previously been obtained not specifically to be used in the campaign?
So similar to the Electoral Act, the bill proposes for the Referendum Act definitions around referendum matter and referendum expenditure and the reason for which the donation was made. But are you asking, is it possible that an entity could have received money 2 years ago for a different purpose and then be using it for now 2 years later for to campaign on the referendum? It is possible.
And what about right now? I mean, if an organisation receives certain financial resources from a foreign donor, not for the purpose of campaigning in the referendum, but nonetheless chooses to use some of those resources to campaign in the referendum, is that prohibited?
It's a little difficult so it'd be an operational matter that the AEC would undertake to look at the actual facts of the donation. What were the motivations for the donation? What was it expected to be used for, and how was it used by the organisation? I think that's probably a question that's best placed to the Australian Electoral Commission.
And thinking that through, what sort of resources are being proposed to be provided to the AEC to help them with this ambiguous area of oversight?
So any additional funding provided to the AEC is picked up in their the overall expenditure that will be incurred for the referendum. So to date, in the 22-23 October budget, $75.1 million was provided for preparatory work, of which 52.6 went to the Australian Electoral Commission, and there was 16.1 million to increase First Nations enrolment, and there was also 6.5 million that went to the NIAA. In addition to this, there's $160 million in the contingency reserve that was disclosed, The balance of the cost for the referendum we would expect to be settled in the 23-24 budget once further details are known. And so that resourcing would cover the AEC's requirements for all of its operational role in undertaking a referendum, including work around disclosures and donations.
And that, just to be clear, I think this has already been given in your evidence before, but I think I'm correct in raising this at this point. So Zali Stegel, the member for Warringah, has provided a submission which I believe is published. Is that right, Chair? Sorry, I won't.
That was the one that we authorised this morning, yes.
Oh, great, thank you. So she's just raising so she has a private member's bill, which is essentially, the paraphrasing of it is a truth in advertising type measure, and this committee in a separate inquiry is considering truth in advertising potentially for future general elections. But this bill does not propose to have any such change to the existing rules around truth in advertising, and there's no resourcing being provided, therefore, to the AEC to oversee any truth in advertising type measure if it was put into this bill. That's correct?
I'm not familiar with Zali Stegel's submission. I'm sorry, obviously it hasn't been made public yet.
Yep.
This bill looks to align, so when I said in my opening statement, as far as possible, the Referendum Machinery Act with the Electoral Act. If there were to be changes around the truth in advertising that you're referring to, there would be opportunities to look at the referendum bill at the same time. One thing that this bill does propose, though, is that so I talked about the threshold before of $15,200 indexed each year. This bill proposes tying the Referendum Act to the Electoral Act. So if there were changes in the financial disclosure threshold made through the Electoral Act, it would flow through to the Referendum Act.
Thank you. So I've got more questions, but Chair, if others have got questions, I don't mind waiting my turn again.
At this stage, I don't have any indications from others that they have questions.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll just ask.
Go ahead.
Please interrupt me at any point.
Will do.
So just on the budget side of things, was there I'm sorry if I'm missing this, but this is related to the issuing of the pamphlet and the change in this bill, which will obviously not have that requirement anymore. Do you know if the department had a costing on what that would cost and or therefore how much that will save by removing that requirement for the physical distribution of a document to all electors as per the existing requirements?
The department undertook a range of costings in supporting this bill in all elements of the bill. Those costings formed advice to government as part of Cabinet and its subcommittee's deliberations.
So the sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said that the budgeted expenditure on the referendum was 160 million. Just checking that's correct.
So what I said is in the October 22-23 budget, the most immediate budget just passed, there was $75.1 million allocated by the government for preparatory work for the referendum, of which 52.6 went to the Australian Electoral Commission, 16.1 million to increase First Nations enrolment levels, and 6.5 to the NIAA. In addition to that, there is already $160 million provisioned in the contingency reserve that was disclosed in the pre-election fiscal outlook and has stayed in there since then. And any further costs or expenditure we would expect to be settled in the 23-24 budget as further details around timing and form of the referendum firm up.
Right. So sorry, just to make sure I understand that correctly, there's a $160 million contingency in PFO for a referendum on the
Yes.
voice.
Yes. But there's also been $75.1 million above that being allocated.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Understood. And so is a $160 million the projected cost of the actual undertaking of the referendum?
No, it's a provision. That's how the contingency reserve is used. As I said,
So do you have a costing on the actual conduct of the referendum?
No, we would expect the cost of the referendum to be settled in the 23-24 budget context as further information about its conduct is firmed up.
But you have provided advice to government saying, hey, if we get rid of this pamphlet thingamy, then it'll save you this amount of money. So you've obviously provided advice more broadly about the costing of a referendum.
So we provided costings to government on a range of options for the conduct of the referendum. And as I said, that went to advice that went to cabinet deliberations.
Okay. I'm just bear with me for one moment. And so the 23-24 budget, and sorry, this is on the basis that, I mean, the Prime Minister's now advised publicly about the intention of the Parliament passing enabling legislation in the current financial year, subject to the Parliament being able to, do that in a timely fashion, and that the referendum itself, if the Parliament passed the legislation to hold the referendum, will be in the 23-24 financial year. And you're saying that the 23 or the May budget for the 23-24 year will deal with the issue of how much a referendum to change the Constitution in line with the voice proposal will cost government.
We would expect the 23-24 budget to take account of any further funding that's required above what's already been allocated, the 160 in the contingency reserve and the 75.1 million.
All right, thank you very much.
Chair, I think Senator Cadell has more questions.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I'm back on my phone given my speaker has died.
Good
My
plan.
microphone has died.
Go ahead, please. We can hear you.
Sorry, gentlemen. We spoke before I cut out about the flow of the track of money, and we just want to stay on that financial disclosure bit. How does the legislation propose to track the flow of money to expenditure on electoral matters and activities? And given this is the government stated that they want to have a education campaign, and there's many things around Aboriginal affairs that are broad, how is this going to be tracked? Is there a definition of what is electoral matter activities, or is there a broad statement of what that is?
So the bill does include definitions for referendum matters and referendum expenditure. That goes to, I think your question might be in two parts, Senator, but correct me if I'm wrong. There's the donations that are made to referendum entities, and so the bill provides definitions of referendum matter and referendum expenditure and what that would constitute. It's a separate issue around the suspension of Section 11.4 and the funding of a civics campaign to assist the community understand referendum and the process of a referendum. So they're two separate issues.
Okay. Going on that, just sidetrack on that 11.4 thing, seeing you raised it. I note that the House of Reps inquiry in 2021 on the inquiry into constitutional reform and referendum recommended that Section 11 referendum be amended to allow the Electoral Commission to distribute the yes and no cases through other means in addition to the existing provision of the paper pamphlet. In your advice to government, did that committee report come up that it wasn't just about taking away paper because it was deemed no longer fully fit for purpose, but it was the committee had prior recommended other means be available to it for disclosure?
So in providing our advice to government, we took into account a range of parliamentary inquiries and reports, including the one you've cited, informing the advice that we provided to government.
Okay, thanks very much. So going back to disclosure now, we heard from the AEC last time about the ability of entities to potentially shut up shop and not be ongoing. So does the current scheme of electoral financial disclosure operate on the basis that significant electoral entities or referendum entities are going to be ongoing?
No, it relates to entities' expenditure in the referendum entities, and that's defined in the legislation, their expenditure in the 6 months prior to the issuing of the writ through to the day of the poll.
Okay, done. Would it become difficult for the scheme to operate if entities become special purpose vehicles, become set up from scratch each electoral cycle, so there is no ongoing compliance and no stakeholders when the lodgements are required to be made?
I would need to take that one on notice, Senator, to probably give you a fulsome answer. But you're only referring to referendums, though? You're not referring to an election, I'm assuming?
Yeah, in this specific item, yeah.
So I'll take it on notice to see if we can provide you more information, but there would still be, as I said, a requirement for entities that have been or established or are established and participating in the referendum in that 6-month period prior to the writ through to the polling day to disclose donations and expenditure above the threshold. But I'll take your question on notice to see if we can provide you with more detail.
Yeah, my specific concern is around if they no longer exist, if they wind up prior to declarations.
We'll take that on notice.
Thank you. How did the department assess the application of current donations regime using federal elections, federal electoral events against the referendum? Is there a continuous process while one is standalone? Did you define a difference between the two?
So as I said in my opening statement, the work around this particular bill is twofold. It's one, where possible, to align the Referendum Act and the Electoral Act. And then secondly, it was to modernise the Referendum Act, given that it was last used in 1999. So they were the two, I guess, overarching considerations. And when it came to these matters, we were looking at, as far as possible, aligning the two.
Was the original assumption of the department that there would be an official campaign for yes and no via the government funding?
We didn't make, I guess, original assumptions. We provided advice on a range of options for the referendum.
Okay.
It's for government to make the decisions.
Yep, that's understandable. Yeah, but I imagine when you're planning how stuff happens, you would look at what is likely to happen and base some contingencies around that.
So we provide advice that obviously goes to the current Act and how it had been used previously, and ways you could look to modernise that Act, as I said, and to, as far as possible, ensure that there was continuity between the Electoral Act and the Referendum Act.
Okay. The AEC earlier provided evidence in question around the, given the fact that I think there's a requirement that any referendum is held before 6 months of the passing of the bill, and this has a 6 month retrospective reporting date. The AEC has provided evidence that the committee that there may be organisations who will be accruing responsibilities under this disclosure even now? Has the department provided advice to the government about that potential outcome?
Our advice has always gone to the Referendum Act as it currently stands and options to reform that Act. And the government,
I understand,
and the government has, in putting forward this bill to the Parliament, has made a decision that picks up the period of 6 months prior to the issuing of the writ, which I would say also aligns with, so in an electoral context, a candidate, a new candidate who runs for a particular seat, that they have a 6-month period before announcing their candidacy. So it's similar in that sense. If we're talking about where we're looking at where it's practical to align the two pieces of legislation.
My difference is that a candidate is dealing with a known piece of legislation and the requirements are ongoing in an election. This is changing the requirements for a referendum thing, given it is required that the referendum happens before 6 months of the passing of legislation. We are effectively, there could be people now accepting donations or spending money that may be in breach if the referendum were to happen 5 months and 28 days from now, aren't there?
So there could be organisations that are accepting donations, but they are not in breach because the reporting obligation is for those referendum entities to report, I think it's within 15 weeks of the referendum, the polling day. So they could be receiving donations now, but they're not in breach.
But they might not be keeping records now that allow them to lodge a compliant report because they're unaware of them. This is not law yet. Is that not right?
So there's provision in the legislation. The bill makes provision for circumstances where a person, or an entity is unable to obtain the particulars required for the return. And in this case, the expectation is those entities complete the return to the extent possible and provide the AEC with a statement of reasons as to why they couldn't do that.
Okay. Has the government asked for, or even has the department provided any advice to the government about this potential outcome?
We provided advice to the government on the bill.
On this particular aspect of people potentially receiving funds and expending funds without knowing what disclosure was required?
The department has provided a range of advice on options, and that advice has covered the financial disclosure regime.
Given there's been some proposed amendments spoken about in public space, what happens if through the process of legislation the disclosure things and that changes? People even foggy, got less idea what they have to do to comply now? Is it a real possibility that amendments may put people who have good intentions even more at a disadvantage now because the 6-month period will tie up areas before they know what the rules are?
I think, Senator, you're asking for an opinion there. All I can say is that the bill is before the Parliament. It is up to the Parliament to pass or not pass that bill and pass with any amendments that the Parliament sees fit.
Okay. I'm happy to rest there, Chair, for a little bit, but I've got some more I can come back to on foreign interference.
I don't think we have anyone else waiting at the moment, Senator Cadell, so continue.
So I'll continue. And very similar questions about special purpose things on foreign interference and going back, getting that on record. How does the current scheme as it operates for federal elections require entities to avoid foreign donations, not referenda?
Senator Scott Delly, First Assistant Secretary Finance. The current scheme, which has been in place for a little while now, it precludes the receipt and provision of donations for matters intended to influence an electoral matter. And so a similar approach has been taken with this proposed referendum bill.
Okay.
So
And how
with
does
that,
this-
sorry, could I just
Yep.
reiterate the $100 threshold is consistent across both
Yep.
both
Understood.
frameworks.
And how does the scheme deal with a donation that has been made in the past that was against the requirements for a foreign donation?
We'll take that on notice, Senator. I think that goes to the question you asked before that we said we would try to get some further information, and we'll also,
Yeah.
to be honest, we'll need to talk with the Australian Electoral Commission too, because they handle this operationally on a day-to-day basis, so we would need to seek advice from them as well.
So to be clear, on notice, we're talking about retrospectivity of donations of Australians and single-purpose entities and foreign donations. So specific, I will ask that question and just say on notice, I'm happy. Has the scheme dealt with entities who have received an illegal foreign donation, but where the entity in question now ceases to exist?
Yes, we'll take that on notice.
And is there a time limit on a breach of the foreign donation scheme?
Take that on notice as well, Senator.
Okay. In the terms of the referendum, who will be responsible under this scheme for tracking of organisation and entities created for the purposes of seeking donations?
The Australian Electoral Commission.
Okay. And is the AEC going to be provided with additional funding and resources to undertake that role?
So I think that goes to the questions we were answering before. The AEC receives funding for sort of in totality for its role to undertake a referendum, which would include anything around financial disclosure, the financial disclosure regime.
So there'll be a separate allocation to the AEC to operate all aspects of this. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there won't necessarily be a separate allocation. It wouldn't be necessarily a line item. It would be in the budget they receive to conduct the referendum, but they would receive funding to undertake all of their responsibilities that are included in the conduct of a referendum.
Okay. And has that amount been finalised yet?
So I'd refer to my previous answer there saying that, and I can go over that again if you'd like me to, but...
Yep, I would.
So in the 2022-23 budget, the government provided $75.1 million for preparatory work for the referendum. 52.6 of that was allocated to the Australian Electoral Commission for their preparatory work. 16.1 million went to the AEC towards increasing First Nations enrolment. 6.5 million went to NIAA. In addition, there's been $160 million allocated in the contingency reserve, and we would expect any further funding requirements to be settled in the 23-24 budget context.
But there isn't a specific budget estimate about what the new compliance costs as a line item themselves would be?
No, it's included in the AEC's overall responsibilities.
Yep. And will those resources, obviously you've got contingency funds, will those resources be provided beyond the referendum to ensure the follow-up of all those organisations and entities who may subsequently declare illegal donations be captured?
So what I would say is in the conduct of, in the process of completing a costing, the Australian Electoral Commission would work with the Department of Finance and the Australian Electoral Commission would put forward their best estimates on what it will cost them to conduct the referendum and undertake all of their responsibilities, including responsibilities in this space, and the Department of Finance would work through a costing with them.
Okay. And final question on this: has the department been part of developing any material relating to how the scheme will work for the entities or donors?
The Department of Finance has not been involved in any of that particular work. That is operational, and that would be undertaken by the Australian Electoral Commission.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cadell. Any further questions?
Chair, if it's Maurice, sorry, I think it's better if I have my video off for making the audio work better. I just wanted to check with you in the absence of the Deputy Chair. As you know, he sent a letter to you in December seeking the appearance of the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Special Minister of State at this hearing today. And you responded more recently that that would not be the case. This is something which the members of the committee, with Senator McGrath, who support that call, take very seriously in terms of questions that have not been able to be answered. By officials. And we understand, of course, the limitations on officials in terms of their ability to respond on questions of reasons for policy and approaches taken. And to that end, the Coalition is keen to press our request for the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Special Minister of State to attend to discuss those matters with the committee.
Thank you, Senator Payne. Yes, I think that letter was included in the committee's correspondence, and as you say, I have responded to it and noted that the government's intentions are set out in the second reading speech, as is the usual practice, and as such, it's not the intention to have ministers appear at the hearing today. So if there are no further questions, I will say thank you to our witnesses for their attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I thank all our witnesses for appearing at the public hearing today, and I close the public hearing. And before I lose member